Emmy was 4 years old. She used to sing every morning while her mother brushed her hair. Then a man came to stand in her bedroom doorway, night after night, in the dark. And one morning, Emmy just stopped. No songs, no words, just silence and her sister's hand. Her mother ran, across Missouri, through Kansas, into a Wyoming winter that nearly killed all three of them. To a stranger's door, to a man who didn't know yet that a little girl's first word back would be the one thing that finally broke him open. This channel exists for stories like this one, raw frontier love, the unbreakable thread between a mother and her children, the cowboys who showed up quietly and stayed loudly, and the moments when broken people find each other and choose to heal. The lesson here isn't about survival. It's about what comes after. The courage to trust again, to speak again, to call a stranger by the name you always hoped someone would deserve. Subscribe if you believe in that kind of story. Share it if you know someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment. I want to know where in the world you're reading this from.
Ruth's 7-year-old Nora whispered, "Mama, the driver is not breathing anymore." That cold truth cut through the wind. Ruth forced the coach door open and stumbled into a world of white. The snow blinded her as she clawed her way to the driver's seat. Bill Mercer was frozen solid, his eyes wide open, still holding the reins to horses that stood like statues in the snow. Ruth shook his shoulder, but he was gone. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, just like her grandmother had taught her. She felt for a pulse, but there was nothing. Climbing back down, her numb hands missed the step and she fell deep into the snow. She fought her way back to the coach, back to her children. Nora looked at her with the eyes of an old woman. "Is he dead, Mama?" Ruth had promised her daughter she would never lie, not after they ran from a man named Silas. "Yes, he is." Nora's next question was even harder. "Are we going to die too?" "No," Ruth said, pulling herself inside and shutting the door against the storm. Emmy was on the seat, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her body had gone quiet an hour ago. Ruth knew what that meant. When the shivering stops, the body is giving up. She pulled her baby close, tucking her inside her own coat, pressing the little girl's freezing skin against her own. "Emmy, baby, stay with Mama," she pleaded. "You stay right here." Emmy did not answer. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Nora's voice was calm. Too calm for a little girl. Through the frozen window there was nothing but blinding snow. Somewhere out there, a man named Jesse Hawkins was waiting with a warm fire. A man she had lied to in a letter. "We walk," Ruth said simply. "Emmy will die if we stay in this coach. She needs a fire right now." A while back, she had seen fence posts along the road. "A fence leads to a ranch," she told Nora. "We will follow it." Nora looked at her little sister's blue lips, then pulled on her own thin coat. "I will carry the bag." Ruth's heart nearly broke seeing her 7-year-old daughter stand so bravely, ready to march into a blizzard. "You stay right behind me," Ruth ordered. "Hold on to my coat and do not let go." She wrapped Emmy tight inside her own coat until only the child's small face was visible, her shallow breaths ghosting against Ruth's neck. Then she opened the door and stepped into the storm. The cold was a monster, clawing at her face and pushing her back. Ruth leaned into the wind and walked. She felt Nora's small hand gripping the back of her coat. She found the fence line by walking right into a post. The wood hit her knee and she fell, the impact jolting Emmy. She tasted blood where she bit her tongue, but she got back up and found the wire. They moved from one post to the next. Then through the wind, Ruth smelled something. Wood smoke. A fire was burning somewhere close. "Nora, I smell smoke," she yelled. Hope surged through her. She followed the fence line, her legs burning and her fingers numb. Suddenly she saw it. A little yellow light in the middle of all that white. A window. "Hello!" Ruth screamed into the wind. "Please, help us!" The wind swallowed her voice. She pushed through a gate, stumbled across a yard, and finally found the porch. She climbed the steps she could not see and found the door. Ruth beat on the door with her frozen hand. It swung open to reveal a big man holding a rifle. His hair was wild from sleep, and his gray eyes were sharp, like a man who was used to trouble. "Who in the hell are you?" he demanded. "Ruth Calloway," she gasped. "You sent for me. The driver is dead out on the road. My daughter is dying in my arms. We need your fire. Please let us in." Jesse Hawkins looked at the woman covered in snow, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He saw the small, blue-lipped face of the child tucked inside her coat. He did not hesitate. "Get inside, now." Ruth rushed past him straight to the fireplace. She fumbled with her coat buttons, her fingers useless with cold, and finally pulled Emmy free. "I need that fire built up," she said, her back to him, "and blankets, and warm water." Jesse put his rifle down and moved fast. He threw logs on the fire and pulled blankets from a nearby chest. He worked quickly while Ruth peeled the frozen clothes off her daughter and wrapped her in a warm blanket. "Mama?" Nora stood in the doorway, covered in snow, the family's small bag in her hand. Her eyes darted from the strange man to the rifle leaning against the wall. "Come here, baby," Ruth said, holding out an arm. Nora ran to her mother's side but kept her eyes locked on Jesse. Jesse noticed the look. He saw Nora come into the room, and he did the math in his head. He turned to Ruth. "Your letter said you were alone." "I know what it said," Ruth answered, her voice trembling. "That is a 7-year-old girl, and this is a 4-year-old. Your letter said you were alone, Miss Calloway." "It is Mrs. Calloway. I am a widow," she said, meeting his hard gaze. "This is Emmy, and she is 4. The one staring at you is Nora, and she is 7. I lied because I had to. No man would send for a woman with 2 children in the middle of a Wyoming winter." Jesse's jaw was tight. He stood up, and Nora flinched, stepping back and grabbing her mother's sleeve. The little girl put herself between the strange man and her baby sister. Jesse saw it all, and something in his face softened. The anger was still there, but something else joined it. He looked directly at the little girl, not her mother. "Who taught you to be so scared of men?" Nora just stared back, trembling but brave. Ruth answered for her. "My husband's brother, Silas. After my husband passed, he wanted us out of the house. He was not a kind man." "I am not him," Jesse said, his voice low and meant only for Nora. "I am not the man who hurt your mama. This is my ranch. Nobody gets hurt on my land. Do you understand me?" Nora did not nod, but she kept watching him. Jesse turned back to Ruth. "You picked a hell of a time to show up, Mrs. Calloway. Now I have a dead man to bury, 3 extra mouths to feed, and a winter that is fixin' to kill us all. I sent for a housekeeper, and I got a widow with 2 children and a dangerous man in her past." Ruth flinched. "Silas does not know where we are." "Are you sure about that?" he asked. The question hung in the warm air of the cabin, a threat far colder than the storm outside. Ruth felt a stir and looked down at Emmy. A little color was finally coming back to her daughter's face. She was getting warmer, her pulse a bit stronger. Jesse watched as Ruth expertly chafed the girl's hands and feet. "My grandmother was a healer back in Missouri," she said, not looking up. "Taught me about herbs and fevers. There ain't a doctor for 30 miles, is there?" Jesse just stated a fact. Last one left before the snow. Ruth looked him square in the eye. "Well, I can, doctor. I can also cook, sew, make soap, keep your books, and teach children. My name is Ruth Calloway, and I will work harder than anyone because I have everything to lose. These are my daughters. They come with me. In exchange, I will make this ranch run better than it has since your wife passed. That's a promise." The only sound was the crackling fire. She was on his floor, half frozen, with nothing to her name, yet she was the one setting the terms. "What was her name?" Ruth's voice cut through the quiet. Jesse just stared at her. "Your wife. What was her name?" His voice was tight. "Margaret." "How long has it been?" 14 months. How did she die? Jesse's whole body went stiff as a board. That is not your business. It is if I'm to live in her house. I need to know what I'm walking into. Nobody had spoken to Jesse Hawkins that directly in over a year. Childbirth, he finally bit out. The baby died, too. Ruth's eyes closed for a moment. I am sorry for your trouble. Don't be sorry. Just be what you promised. He grabbed his coat. Room's at the end of the hall. It's got a lock. As he opened the door, a blast of cold air shot in. Where are you headed? Ruth called out. Horses need seeing to, and I need to figure out what in the world just happened. Jesse, she said. He paused at the door. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, his back still to her. We'll be having a talk about that lie of yours soon enough. He stepped out and shut the door on the storm. Nora, who'd been silent on the floor, finally spoke. He's angry, Mama. He's got a right to be. But he gave us a room with a lock on it. Ruth pulled Nora close, holding both her girls. This is not like Uncle Silas's house. After a long quiet, Nora spoke again. Mama? He said I was scared. I'm not scared. Ruth kissed her head. I know, sweet girl. You are the bravest soul I know. Braver than you? Much braver. Nora hugged her tighter. I will watch him. If he's a bad man, I'll be the first to know. I always know. I know you do. Nora grunted. And Mama? I'm hungry. A small smile almost touched Ruth's lips. All right, then. Let's see what this cowboy keeps in his pantry. She gently laid Emmy down by the fire and got to her feet, her legs shaking under her. The kitchen was a picture of a man's grief. Dishes were piled high, flour dusted the counters, and a crusty pot sat on the cold stove. 14 months of a man living alone and broken. The ghost of his wife, Margaret, was in the crooked curtains and the layer of dust on every surface. Ruth found some hard bread and butter from a cold box. She also found a jar of preserved peaches, sealed tight. It was probably Margaret's canning from the summer before she passed. She made a plate for Nora. Eat this slow now. Your stomach isn't used to it. Nora ate like she was starving, and Ruth had to look away from the painful sight. For 6 months, she'd fed her girls first, telling them everything was fine while they all got thinner. She forced herself to eat a slice of bread and a few peaches. She would need her strength. Through the window, she saw a lantern light in the barn. Jesse was out there, likely thinking things over with his horses for company. After washing the single plate, Ruth checked on Emmy, whose color was now a healthy pink. She carried her to the room Jesse had mentioned. It was small, with a clean bed and a solid brass lock on the inside of the door. The lock had been recently oiled. He had prepared for her. He had oiled the lock. Nora climbed onto the bed next to her sister, and the two girls curled up together out of habit. Are we staying here, Mama? For now. The storm has us pinned down. But what about after? Ruth sat on the bed's edge. I am going to make us so useful he can't stand the thought of us leaving. We are going to make ourselves necessary, Nora. We are putting down roots this time. Nora considered this. Roots are good, she said quietly. Things with roots don't get blown away. That's exactly right. Ruth locked the door, checking it twice. She sat in a chair by the window and finally let herself tremble. Not from cold, but from relief. They had made it. They were inside with a fire, a locked door, and a man who, for all his anger, had brought a sick child in from a blizzard. Emmy was alive, and Nora was fed. Outside, Jesse Hawkins was in his barn, dealing with the turn his life had just taken. Tomorrow, Ruth decided she would cook him the best breakfast he'd had in 14 months. She would clean his house until it shined and prove her worth. Tonight, she just breathed. In the bed, Emmy stirred and her lips moved, forming a single quiet word. It was the first thing she'd said in 3 months. Warm. Ruth covered her mouth, silent tears streaming down her face. One small word that meant everything. Ruth was awake before the sun, a daughter tucked in on either side of her. The house was bone-chilling cold. The fire had died down to embers. She crept out quietly, unlocked their door, and made her way to the main room. In minutes, she had the fire going again, coaxing the flames back to life. In the daylight, the kitchen looked even more hopeless. Grease was caked on the stove, and a burned skillet sat accusingly on top. She found a tin of coffee, put a pot on to boil, and then, rolling up her sleeves, she began to tackle the mountain of dirty dishes. She was up to her elbows in soapy water when she heard the stomp of boots on the porch. The door swung open and Jesse walked in, his arms full of firewood. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. "You're already up," he said it quiet-like. He'd finished stacking wood by the fireplace and turned to see the kitchen, the clean dishes on the counter and fresh coffee already brewing. Ruth stood there in yesterday's dress, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a piece of cloth. "You nearly died last night," he told her. "Nearly doesn't count," Ruth said, drying her hands. "And this kitchen of yours nearly died a long time ago." Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Margaret kept it better. "I imagine she did. Sit down. If you have eggs, I can have breakfast ready in 10 minutes. The chickens are in the coop out back. Tom usually collects them. Tom Greenfield. He's my ranch hand. Lives in the bunkhouse. 19 years old, a hard worker and quiet." Jesse pulled out a chair but didn't take a seat. "He's out checking on the driver. We'll have to bury Bill Mercer once the ground thaws." The back door flew open, and a young man stomped in, shaking snow from his boots and carrying a basket of eggs. He was tall and lean, with a boy's face in a man's hands, red from the cold. He saw Ruth and froze solid. "Tom, this is Mrs. Calloway. She got here last night." Jesse's voice was flat. "She'll be staying with us." Tom looked from Jesse to Ruth and back again. "Yes, sir. Ma'am." He put the eggs on the counter and left so fast he forgot to close the door behind him. "He's a shy one," Jesse said. "You confused him. You told him one woman was coming and I show up with 2 little ones in a blizzard. I haven't mentioned the children just yet." "Well, you'd better before he walks in and drops a whole basket of eggs." Jesse finally sat down. Ruth cracked 6 eggs into a skillet. The old stove was a difficult thing, but she figured it out quick. Anger always made her work faster, and right now she was mad. Not at Jesse, but at herself for the lie, at Silas for making her lie, and at the whole damn world for making honesty a luxury she couldn't afford. She put a plate in front of Jesse with eggs and toast. The coffee was black and strong. He stared at it like he'd forgotten what a real breakfast looked like. "This is—" He picked up his fork. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, just eat." Ruth leaned against the counter with her own coffee. She hadn't earned a seat at his table yet. Jesse ate without a word. When he was done, he pushed his plate back and held his coffee cup with both hands. "All right, Mrs. Calloway. Your daughter is alive. You are warm and fed. Now it is time to talk." Ruth put her cup down. "Ask your questions. Why did you lie to me? Because I was desperate. I thought the truth would cost my girls their only chance." "You were right. It would have." Jesse's voice was hard. "I wrote that advertisement for one woman, someone to cook and clean, and maybe down the road, to be a wife. I was not looking for a family with children. I know what it is to lose a child, Mrs. Calloway. I buried my own baby girl who never took a single breath, right next to her mother in the South Field. 14 months ago, I stood on that ground and swore I would never feel that kind of hurt again." His hands grew tight around the cup. "And now you've brought 2 little girls into my house without so much as asking." Ruth felt his words hit like stones. He was right, and that made it all the worse. "You had a choice," she said, her voice soft. "You could have left us on that porch. In a blizzard? With a child turning blue? What kind of man do you take me for? I think you're the kind of man who opens his door in a storm. That's why I picked you, Jesse. Your advertisement was the only one that said the woman must be of good character, not young and pretty. You were looking for a person, not just a wife." Jesse just stared at her. "That doesn't make the lie right." "No, it doesn't, and I won't make excuses." Ruth crossed her arms. "But you need to understand. Nora and Emmy are not up for discussion. If you want me to leave when the snow melts, I will, but they go where I go. Always. I'm not putting anyone out in the winter. We have time then. Let me prove my worth. Give me until spring. If you still want us gone then, we'll leave. Just give me a chance to show you that we won't be a burden." Jesse pushed his chair back and walked to the window, his back to her. The little one, Emmy. What happened to her? Why doesn't she talk? Oh, she talks. She just whispers, and only to Nora. Why is that? Ruth's throat felt tight. After my husband Henry died, his kin, Silas, moved in. He wanted us gone. He would come into our room at night, stand over our bed, and tell me if I didn't leave, he'd take my girls. Jessie turned sharply from the window. "He never touched them," Ruth said fast. "I made sure of it." But Emmy heard him, night after night, a big man yelling in the dark. One morning, she just stopped talking. Nora says she still talks when they're alone. She said the word warm last night. It's the first I've heard from her in 3 months. Jessie's face was perfectly still, the way a lake gets before a storm. Where is this Silas now? In Missouri, far as I know. He has no idea where we are. Does he have a legal claim on those girls? The question she had been dreading. He is their closest male relative. He could go to a court and say, "I am an unfit mother," but you are not. You are employed. Am I? Jessie held her gaze. Through the winter, we will see about the rest. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start. From the hallway came a small sound. Nora stood there holding Emmy's hand. The little one hid behind her big sister, peeking at Jessie. "Mama, Emmy's hungry." Ruth started toward them, but Jessie spoke first. He knelt down slow, like he was calming a wild colt. "There are eggs and toast on the stove. Your mama made them. Do you want to come and eat?" Nora looked him over, sizing him up. She saw the space between him and the door, the rifle on the wall, and his open hands. "We can get it ourselves," Nora said. "We don't need your help." "I know you don't need it," Jessie answered. "I am offering it. That is what folks do for each other in a house, they offer." Nora thought about that. Then she walked to the table, pulling Emmy with her, and climbed into a chair. Emmy sat beside her, so small her chin didn't even reach the tabletop. She looked at Ruth, not at Jessie. Ruth made 2 small plates and sat with her daughters. Jessie stood by the fireplace, keeping his distance. Nora ate fast with one arm curled around her plate. Emmy ate slow, as if she had to remember how. "Good eggs," Nora said. "Better than what we got at the church." Jessie grabbed his hat from a hook. "I'll be in the barn for most of the day. Tom and I will be back around dark." He stopped at the door, his eyes on Ruth. He listed what was left. Flour and salt in the pantry, dried beef down below. Margaret's preserves from last summer were on a shelf in the back. He said his dead wife's name like he was walking on thin ice, flat and careful. He told her to ask Tom if she needed anything else. "I'll manage just fine," she said. "I know you will." He put on his hat. "I've seen your brand of stubborn before." She asked if that was a compliment. He said he hadn't decided yet. And then he was gone. The cold air settled. Nora looked at her mother. "He's still upset about the lie." "Yes." "Are you going to say sorry again?" "No," Ruth said. "I'm going to show him sorry." Words are cheap. Ruth started gathering plates. "Finish your breakfast. We have work to do." And they worked. Ruth went at that house like it owed her a debt. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees and cleaned the stove until it shined. She took inventory of the pantry, noting every jar and sack. She saw Margaret's preserves, each one a memory of a future that never came. She left them right where they were. By noon, she was working on the mending pile. It was mostly simple stuff, missing buttons and worn-out socks. She sat by the fire while Nora read animal stories from a book. Emmy was on the floor, drawing on a piece of brown paper with a little piece of charcoal. Ruth watched her daughter's small, careful hands. A shape that looked like a house appeared, then another that looked like a chimney with smoke. Emmy was drawing this very house, this very fire. Ruth's hands stopped their work. She watched her little girl make something from nothing, and a feeling like hope cracked open inside her chest. "That is beautiful, Emmy," she said gently. Emmy kept drawing, her hand moving a little faster. She added a small person next to the house, then a second small person, then a taller one. 3 people standing together. Nora leaned over to see. "That is us, Emmy. Me and you and Mama." Emmy nodded, but she didn't speak. Then she drew one more person, bigger, standing off by himself. "Who is that?" Nora asked. Emmy whispered an answer. Nora looked up at her mother. "She says it is the cowboy man. She says he looks cold all alone out there." Ruth looked at the drawing. 4 people, 3 together and 1 on his own. It was a 4-year-old's view of the morning. A man on one side of his own home and everybody else on the other. "Maybe tomorrow," Ruth said softly, "you could draw him a little closer to us." Emmy looked at her mother, her big brown eyes saying everything she could not. Then she looked back at her drawing and drew a line connecting the lonely man to the little group. She did not move him closer, but she joined them. It was enough. Jesse and Tom returned at dusk, bringing the cold in with them. Jesse stopped right inside the door. He stared. The floor was clean. The dishes were done. A pot of stew warmed the whole house. The mending basket was empty. He looked around his kitchen as if he had walked into the wrong place. "Well, I will be," Tom whistled. "Sit down," Ruth said. "Dinner is ready." Tom sat right down, but Jesse moved slow. He hung up his coat and pulled out a chair, his eyes taking everything in. He noticed the clean floor. He saw his coffee cup, washed and sitting right where Margaret always kept it. "You did not have to do all this," he said, his voice low. "Yes, I did." Ruth served the stew. Beef, potatoes, and carrots she had found. "Eat before it gets cold." Nora watched Jesse like a hawk. Jesse took a bite of the stew. His expression changed. He took another, then a third. "This is good," he said finally. Margaret's preserves helped. She knew her way around a kitchen. His jaw was tight when he said her name, but he nodded. She surely did. After dinner, Jesse stayed at the table while Ruth washed up. "I found something," Ruth said, not looking at him. "A cradle. A small one, made of cedar." Jesse went stiff. "I did not move it. I just wanted you to know that I saw it. It is good work. You made it for the baby. Do not." His voice was torn and ragged. Ruth turned around then. His head was in his hands, his shoulders hunched like he was waiting for a hit. She dried her hands and sat across from him. She did not touch him. "I am not going to pretend it is not there, Jesse. You lost your wife and your child. That loss is in every single corner of this house. What do you want me to say?" "Nothing," she said. "I have my own losses. We can carry them by ourselves, or we can be honest that they are there." Jesse looked up. His eyes were red. "You are a hard woman, Ruth Calloway." "I am a surviving woman," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at this stranger who refused to ignore the very things he had been hiding from for 14 months. A part of him was furious, but another part of him felt a deep sense of relief. "The cradle stays where it is," he said. "Of course it does. And Margaret's preserves. I will not use them without asking." "Use them," he said, his voice rough. "She made them to be eaten. It ain't right when a woman and her little girls have to run for their lives, but that's the world we live in." Ruth Calloway knew that better than anyone. This story is about how the quietest actions can shout louder than any words, and how trust is built one small kindness at a time. If you believe a helping hand can change a life, then listen close. After Jesse pushed his chair in, he paused. He told her, "Ruth, if you're going to cook my meals and mend my socks, you can call me by my name." He said her name, testing it. He mentioned the stew, said his Margaret used to make one like it. But his was different. She told him she found some time. He just nodded and said, "It was good. I will see you in the morning." And then he was gone. Ruth heard his bedroom door click shut. After cleaning up, she went to her own room. Her 2 daughters, Nora and Emmy, were sleeping all tangled up together. Little Emmy was holding a scrap of paper, and Ruth gently slipped it from her hand. In the moonlight, she saw a drawing. It was their house with 3 people together and one standing off to the side. Between them, a single line reached out, drawn by a little girl who could not speak but still knew how to connect. Ruth thought about the man down the hall, Jesse, alone in the bed he had once shared with his wife, staring at a ceiling that had offered him no comfort for 14 long months. She thought about the beautiful empty cradle he had built with his own hands for a child that never came. And she worried about Silas, back in Missouri, wondering if he was hunting for them. Emmy's drawing, though, that one little line reaching out to the lonely figure, gave her a sliver of hope. Maybe her 4-year-old, who was scared to death of men, saw something good. A new life is built one day at a time, one meal at a time. She had done it before, and Lord willing, she would do it again. The days started to blend together under the endless snow. A week turned into 2. The whole world outside Jesse's ranch was just a quiet, white blanket. Ruth held up her end of the bargain. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She learned the temper of that old stove and made bread from scratch since they were snowed in good and proper. Jesse, he kept to himself. He spoke when he had to, about fence posts or how much feed was left. He never spoke to little Emmy, and Emmy never even looked his way. But Ruth was always watching. She saw the extra firewood he stacked by the door each morning before the sun was up. She saw him one night, whittling a small wooden horse. He left it on the kitchen table without a word, and the next morning, Emmy found it. The little girl took it to her corner and held it tight while she drew. Ruth also saw him teach the ranch hand, Tom, how to make porridge one morning when she had been up all night with Emmy's cough. He never said a word about any of it, and Ruth never brought it up. But she tucked each kind act away, painting a picture of a man who showed his heart, even if he could not speak it. Then, on the 15th morning, Nora decided to take matters into her own hands. She went out to collect the eggs and took a little detour to the barn. Nora stood there in the doorway, basket on her arm, and declared, "Your horses are skinny." Jesse looked up from the bridle he was fixing. "They are winter horses. They always get a little thin. Mama says animals get skinny when they are not fed right." Jesse almost cracked a smile. "Your mama has an opinion on just about everything, does not she? She is usually right." Nora walked right in, stopped at the first stall, and eyed the horse inside. When it lowered its head, she jumped back. "He will not hurt you," Jesse said gently. "That is Dutch, dumbest horse in Wyoming, but a gentle soul. I am not scared. I know you are not. I do not think you are scared of much of anything." Nora turned right to him. "I am scared of some things." "Like what?" she was asked. "Like men who are nice at first and then they stop." Jesse put the bridle down slow. He did not get up, just stayed on the hay bale and looked at her. "Your uncle," she said, her voice flat. "He brought us candy the first week. Then he stopped. Then he started coming into our room at night, saying things that made Mama cry." "Nora, you do not have to tell me this," Jesse said softly. "I am telling you so you know," she said, lifting her chin. "I know how men are. They are nice to get what they want. So I am watching you, Jesse Hawkins. I am watching what you do when you think no one is looking." After a long, quiet spell, he finally asked, "What have you seen?" Nora thought for a second. "You leave wood by the door so Mama does not get cold. You carved Emmy a horse, but left it for her to find because you know she is scared. You eat whatever Mama cooks and say it is good, even when the beans were burned last Tuesday." Jesse grunted. "They were not that burned," Nora shot back. "They were pretty burned." Then she added, "And you talk to your dead wife at night. I hear you through the wall. You tell her you're sorry." The hint of a smile on Jesse's face disappeared. "I am not spying," Nora said quick. "The walls are just thin." "What do you think about that?" he asked. "A man talking to a dead woman?" "I think it is sad," she answered, hugging her basket. "I talk to my daddy sometimes, too. I tell him I'm trying to keep Mama and Emmy safe, just like he asked me to." Jesse's voice was rough with emotion when he finally spoke. "That is a heavy burden to put on a child." I am not a child, she insisted. I am the strong one. You can be both, Jessie told her, leaning forward. Listen to me, Nora. I am not your uncle. I will not act friendly now just to turn mean later. The man you see is the man I am. What you see is what you get. So go on and keep your eyes on me. You can watch me all winter. And if I do anything that scares you or your sister, you tell your mama and me, and we will handle it. Deal? Nora, only 7 years old, stood there deciding if she could ever trust again. Deal, she finally said. But I am still watching. I would be disappointed if you stopped. That evening, Nora sat one chair closer to Jessie at the dinner table. Nobody mentioned it, but everyone noticed. A few weeks later, the hard weather broke, and a visitor arrived. Ruth heard the horse's hooves crunching on the packed snow. An old woman on a gray mare, bundled in so many layers she looked like a moving quilt, rode up to the house. "Hattie, what in the world are you doing out in this?" Jessie called from the barn. "Checking on you, you stubborn old mule. Tom's supply run brought news you had a woman and children here. I figured I had better see for myself before the whole territory started gossiping." The old woman dismounted with surprising ease. She pushed the door open without a knock and found Ruth in the kitchen, with little Emmy hiding behind her dress. "Lord have mercy," Hattie Perkins said. "You must be the one." Hattie nodded as if that answered a question she had not asked. "I was the same after my first husband died. Did not speak for 2 months. I was just trying to decide if the world was safe enough for words again." She looked at Emmy with pure understanding. "You take your time, little one." Nora appeared with a book, assessing the stranger. "Who are you?" "I am the old woman down the road who knows everybody's business." "Who are you?" "Nora Calloway. I am 7, and I can read." "Good for you," Hattie said, then turned to Ruth, her voice serious. "Listen, I did not ride 6 miles in this cold for a social call. I came to warn you. People are talking. An unmarried woman, a widower. Children no one has seen before. That talk will turn ugly. Out here, a good name is everything. If folks decide you are improper, they will shut you out for good." "What are you suggesting?" Ruth asked. "Marry him," Hattie said plainly. "Make it legal before the spring thaw brings the church ladies sniffing around. I have only been here 3 weeks. He hardly speaks to me. He does not need to talk to you. He needs to protect you, and you him. A marriage certificate makes you proper. It makes those girls his responsibility under the law." Hattie leaned closer. "And it makes it nearly impossible for anyone to take them from you." The words hit Ruth like cold water. She had been so focused on surviving each day she had not considered the real danger. She was a woman with no legal protections. "Does Jesse know about the man you are running from?" Hattie asked. "I told him about Silas," Ruth said. "I told him he might come for the girls." Hattie nodded. "Then he has already thought of it. Jesse knows what a marriage would mean. He is just too stubborn and scared to say it." The door opened and Jesse came in, shaking snow from his hat. His face went blank when he saw Hattie. "You two been talking?" "We have," Hattie said cheerfully. "Do not start any trouble, Hattie," Jesse warned. "I am not starting trouble, I am preventing it." She stood and pulled on her gloves. "I have said what I came to say. Ruth, thank you for the coffee. Jesse, you are a fool, but a decent one." She looked at Nora. "You keep on reading, little one. Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take from you." And with that, she left. The house felt quiet and large without her. "She told you to marry me," Jessie said, breaking the silence. "She told me to protect my daughters," Ruth answered. "Coming from Hattie, that is the same thing." Ruth dried her hands and turned to face him. "Is she wrong?" Jessie sank into a chair at the table. He looked at the woman who had made his house feel like a home again in just 3 weeks. "If Silas comes," he said slowly, "he will take them. A judge will always side with a blood relative over an unmarried mother living in a man's house. I know. But if you are my wife, they become my stepdaughters. He would have no legal ground to stand on. I know that too. Then you know what I have to ask. Say it anyway, she whispered. This is not about me wanting a wife, he said, his hands flat on the table. This is about protecting those girls. It is about giving you and them my name so no one can ever take them from you. That is the agreement. And Margaret? Ruth asked softly. He flinched. Margaret would tell me to stop being a fool and do the right thing. She would want me to protect those children. That is what this would be. Protection. It is the only promise I can make you right now. That night, Jesse found a man who carved toys for a child who was scared of him and left firewood by the door for her mama. A man who spoke to his dead wife because he did not know how to talk to the living. Ruth looked him square in the eye. I have my conditions, she said. Name them, he replied. The girls will call you what they want. You do not push them, especially Emmy. She will come around in her own time, or she will not. Agreed, he said without hesitation. And I keep to my own room. A marriage on paper does not mean anything else. Not until we are both ready for it. Agreed. And I would not expect anything less. One last thing, Ruth said, leaning in. You stop apologizing to Margaret's ghost for being alive. She is gone, Jesse. She would want you to live. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the table and laid his hand palm up. It was a strong hand, calloused and scarred. A hand that had built a home and buried a family. A hand that had not thought twice about pulling her daughter in from the freezing cold. Ruth looked at that hand, and then she put hers right in it. When the road's clear, Jesse said, we will find a preacher. Just us, the girls, and Tom as a witness. That is enough, Ruth whispered. Ruth, he said. His fingers tightened around hers. I cannot promise you love. I do not know if I have that left. I am not asking for love, she said. I am asking for honesty and a safe place to build something that matters. Can you give me that? I can try. Then I will try too. They sat like that, their hands joined on the table. They were two people making a promise not about romance, but about survival. Nora's voice drifted in from the other room, reading a story to Emmy. On the paper in her lap, Emmy was drawing again. The house was there, and the three figures were together. But the fourth figure was not standing apart anymore. She had moved him closer. He was almost touching them. He was almost home. The circuit preacher, a man named Reverend Amos Crane, came by on the first clear day of March. Jesse brought him back to the ranch that morning. Ruth dressed the girls in their best clothes. Nora even wore a ribbon. Hattie came wearing the blue ribbon that stood out against her dark hair, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Emmy was in a dress Ruth made from Hattie's leftover fabric, clutching her little wooden horse and holding tight to Nora's hand. But Ruth, she wore Margaret's dress. She hadn't meant to. She was just looking for a tablecloth in Jesse's old trunk, and there it was. Simple cream cotton with a few flowers stitched on the hem. It fit her so perfectly it felt like either a blessing or a curse, and she couldn't figure which. When she stepped out, Jesse just stopped breathing. The color drained right out of his face. I can change, she said, her voice small. I should have asked you. His own voice was rough when he answered. Don't. She would have wanted you to wear it. The ceremony itself was over in 4 minutes. The preacher spoke the words, Jesse said I do, and Ruth said I do. Her eyes filled with a mix of fear and thanks. You may kiss the bride, the preacher said. Jesse leaned in, and Ruth met him halfway. It was a quick, careful kiss, more like sealing a deal than starting a fire. Well, Hattie said, wiping a tear, that's that. Ruth Hawkins. The name felt different, lighter, like she'd finally set down a heavy bag she'd been carrying for years. They all sat down to dinner together, a real family for the first time. Tom told a story about Jesse digging a cow out of a snowdrift, and Hattie told one about her own wedding 42 years ago. Nora let out a real laugh, and Emmy looked up from her drawing, studying the sound like she was trying to remember it. Later, after everyone had gone and the girls were in bed, Ruth stood in the hall. Jesse was in his doorway. "I meant what I said," he told her. "Nothing has to change." "I know," she said. "Good night, Jesse." "Good night, Ruth." Two doors closed, but the space between them felt smaller now. The weeks that followed felt something like peace. Jesse started coming in from the barn earlier, sitting with her while she cooked. He didn't talk a whole lot, but he was there. He'd answer Nora's questions about the ranch, but he gave Emmy her space. Still, he'd leave little things for her to find. A smooth creek stone, a piece of drawing charcoal, even a second, smaller wooden horse so the first one wouldn't be lonely. Emmy never said thank you, but Ruth saw her drawings change. The fourth little person in her pictures was getting closer to the other three. One time, Ruth found a drawing where all four of them were under one roof, with smoke just pouring out of the chimney. Nora explained it one night. She draws her wishes. All that smoke means the house is warm inside. She wants it to always be warm. "It will be," Ruth promised. "I'll make sure of it." But trouble found them in April, soon as the roads cleared. A letter came with the mail rider. Jesse walked up to the clothesline, holding the envelope. "It's for you," he said. "From some lawyer in St. Louis." Ruth's hands froze. "Just open it," she said. "We don't have secrets." She watched his face go hard and still as he read. That was a look she was learning meant danger. "It's Silas," he said, his voice flat. "He's filed a petition to take custody of Nora and Emmy. The world just fell out from under her." "On what grounds?" she asked, grabbing the line to stay standing. "Abandonment. He's claiming you ran off with the children and are living in an unfit home. He's hired a big city lawyer, Ruth. They want the court to force you to bring the girls back to Missouri." "No." The word shot out of her. "He can't have them. He drove us from our home. He terrified my girls." "The law doesn't always see what's right," Jesse said grimly. "It only sees what's written down. But he filed this before we were married, before I legally adopted them." Hattie was right. This marriage changes things. Does it change it enough? "I don't know," Jesse admitted. "We're gonna need a lawyer. We can't afford one." "We'll afford it," he said, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. It wasn't hard at her, but at the whole world. "Nobody has taken those girls from this ranch. Not while I'm drawing breath." Ruth stared at the man who just 3 months ago wanted nothing to do with children. Now he was standing here ready to fight for two girls that weren't even his own blood. "You mean that?" she whispered. "I've never meant anything more." "Jesse, this could get ugly. Silas has money." "Then we'll get ugly right back," he said. "I've got this ranch, a marriage license, and folks who will speak for you. And we've got a 7-year-old girl who can tell a judge exactly what kind of man Silas Calloway is." "I won't put Nora through that," Ruth said. "You might not have a choice." The old fear, the one she'd carried all the way from Missouri, started creeping back up her spine. The fear that no matter how far she ran, Silas would find a way to take her girls. "Ruth." Jesse stepped closer. "Look at me. When I married you, I married those girls too. Nora and her fire, Emmy and her drawings. All the broken pieces you brought here. They're my pieces now. They're mine." She took the letter, the cold lawyer words feeling like ice in her hands. "He knows where we are," she said softly. "How?" Jesse shook his head. "No telling. Word travels. These things are hard to keep quiet. I need to tell Nora." "Not yet," he said. "First, I'm going to ride to town and find us a lawyer. Get some proper advice. Then we'll tell her, together." "Together," she repeated. The word still felt brand new. Jesse rode out the next morning and came back with a name. Arthur Blaine, an attorney at law. Jesse trusted Blaine, a smart lawyer who owed him a favor from an old fence dispute 3 years back. But the news he brought back turned Ruth's blood to ice. "There's a man in town asking questions," Jesse said, his hat still on. "Young fella from Missouri, asking about a Calloway woman with 2 girls. Ruth collapsed into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. It was a hired man sent to confirm she was here before Silas himself came. That gave them weeks at most. Then he would either come in person or send the law. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We get ahead of him," Jesse said firmly. "Blaine is filing our own petition tomorrow. It will document our marriage, my adoption of the girls, and Hattie's good word for you. We will build a case so strong it cannot be touched." "And if it is?" Jesse's jaw was set. "Then I stand between that man and my girls. He will have to go through me to get to them." Somehow, Nora found out. She always did. Ruth found her sitting on the bed with the letter in her hands, her face ghost white. "Where did you get that?" "Papa's coat pocket." The word struck Ruth hard. Papa. Nora had never called him anything. Now, with a threat looming, she had. "Is Uncle Silas coming to take us?" "He is trying," Ruth said, sitting beside her. "But we will not let him. He will be mean and say terrible things." "Then I will tell them," Nora said, her voice steady. "I will tell the judge what Uncle Silas did, how he yelled until Emmy stopped talking. I will tell them it all. Sweetheart, that is a hard thing to do in front of strangers." "I have done harder things," Nora stated plainly. Ruth pulled her close, holding on to this impossibly strong little girl. "You are the bravest person I know, Nora." "Because it is always true." The door at the end of the hall creaked open. Jesse stood there. Ruth knew from his face that he had heard everything. He looked from Nora to the letter in her hands. "Did you just call me Papa?" he asked, his voice low. Nora lifted her chin. "Yes. You do not have to." "I know. I want to," she said, her eyes burning bright. "You gave us a safe room. You carved Emmy a horse. You are fighting for us." She paused. "My real daddy would have liked you." Jesse put a hand on the door frame to steady himself. This quiet, walled-off man was being given a key. "I am going to do everything I can," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nobody is taking you from this ranch, Nora. Not Silas, not any judge." "I know." Then Nora walked to Jesse, and for the first time hugged him tight around the waist. Jesse's hands were uncertain for a moment, then came to rest on her shoulders. Ruth saw Emmy in the doorway, clutching her wooden horse. The little girl watched her sister, then slowly crossed the room. She stopped at Jesse's side and wrapped her small fist around two of his fingers. She did not look at him, but she held on tight. Jesse looked down at her hand, and his face just broke open. Not in sadness, but like the hard winter ground breaking in the spring. "Well," he said, his voice ruined, "I guess that settles it." Emmy whispered something quiet. Nora heard it. "She says," Nora choked out, "you are not cold anymore." Jesse closed his eyes, his large hand gentle around Emmy's small one. "No," he said, "I reckon I am not." The four of them stood in the hallway, a family finally holding on to each other. Later that night, Ruth stood in the hallway, looked at Jesse's door, and made her choice. She knocked. Jesse opened it, still in his day clothes, minus his boots. He waited. "I do not want to sleep alone," she said. "Not from fear. I'm just tired of a door being between us." He stepped aside. The room was spare, with a photo of Margaret on the dresser. "She is beautiful," Ruth said softly. She was. Ruth faced him. "I am not replacing her, but I am choosing to be here. For you." His hand trembled as he tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. "I am not good at this, Ruth. Then let me in." He kissed her then, not a careful, proper kiss like at their wedding. This was honest and raw, tasting of old grief and new hope. She kissed him back, pouring all her love for this stubborn, broken man into that one act. "Stay," he whispered against her mouth. "I am. I am staying tonight, and every night after." "Good, then stop talking." Later, lying in the dark with his arm around her, Ruth felt safe from the coming storm. "Jessie," she whispered, "whatever happens with Silas, you need to know something. I came here just looking for a way to survive. You gave me that, and you gave me love, too." She laid her hand on his chest. "I love you, because you are the kind of man who carves a wooden horse for a little girl who is afraid of him, because you are finally letting people in." He was silent for a long moment, and then his arm tightened. "I love you too," he said, his voice heavy. "I sure did not plan on it. Fought it hard. But you walked into my life with 2 frozen children, and somehow you made everything better. You made me better. It was better this way." He pressed his lips to her hair. "We did it," he whispered. Ruth just closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the real fight would start. A fight with lawyers, letters, and a man from Missouri dead set on taking her children. But for tonight, she was loved. Her daughters were safe. She was home in a way she'd never felt before. Ruth Hawkins had finally learned that home isn't a place you just find. It's something you build, one nail and one meal at a time. You build it with trust, alongside someone brave enough to build it right there with you. Silas Calloway rode in on a Tuesday morning in late April. The last of the snow was retreating up the mountains, and the creek behind the house was swollen with meltwater. Ruth was at the kitchen table teaching Nora her numbers when she heard the horses. 2 of them, moving fast. She went to the window, and her heart just stopped. She knew him from 200 yards out. The way he sat a horse, the set of his shoulders. He even wore his hat tilted the same way Henry used to. "Nora, take your sister to the back room and lock the door." Nora saw her mother's face and knew not to ask why. She just grabbed Emmy's hand and ran. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, then took it off and folded it neatly. She walked onto the porch, stood up straight, and waited for the man who'd chased her 1,000 miles to finally ride into her yard. Silas Calloway reined his horse in about 10 feet from the porch. He looked thinner than Ruth remembered, with a harder set to his face. The fella beside him was older, wearing a suit under his duster and carrying a leather briefcase. The lawyer. "Ruth," Silas said, with that smile she knew all too well. It was the same one he'd used that first week when he brought candy for Nora. "You're looking well. Country life seems to suit you. Get off my property, Silas." "Your property?" He swung down from his horse. "Last I checked, this place belongs to a man named Hawkins. You're just the hired hand who got lucky with a ring." The man in the suit got down more carefully. "Mrs. Hawkins, my name is Gerald Puit. I represent Mr. Calloway in the matter of Nora and Emmeline Calloway's custody." Just then, the barn door creaked open. Jesse came out with Tom right behind him. He walked steady across the yard, but Ruth saw the things Silas couldn't. She saw how Jesse's right hand hung loose near his side, and how Tom moved out wide, putting himself between the house and the visitors. They had planned for this day. Jesse stopped next to Ruth on the porch, their shoulders touching. "Mr. Calloway," Jesse said, his voice calm, "you're on my land." Silas's smile never faltered. He said, "I am their uncle, their father's own brother. Their mother stole them in the middle of the night and brought them to this forsaken place." Ruth's voice was like ice. "She brought them somewhere safe. From what I understand, your house was the last thing from safe." The smile on Silas's face flickered. He called it stories and drama, saying my brother had spoiled her. He claimed that after Henry passed, she left out of pure spite because she could not accept the house was his. Ruth's voice cut through the air. "She left because you terrified my 4-year-old daughter into silence." Silas's jaw went tight. He called Emmeline a fragile and quiet child. "She was not quiet before you came," Ruth declared. "She used to sing every single morning. She has not sung a note in 8 months because of you." "That is just your side of it," Silas sneered. "A court of law will hear my side. Then let the court hear it." Jesse stepped off the porch. He was taller and broader than Silas, but it was the pure certainty in his voice that made the other man step back. "I have legally adopted those girls. This ranch is their home, and their mother is my wife. If you want to take them, you will use the proper legal channels, but you will not come to my home and threaten my family again." The lawyer Pwitt stepped up, all calm and professional. "Mr. Hawkins, no one is making threats. We are here to assert Mr. Calloway's rights. His rights were forfeit when he scared a woman and 2 children from their home," Jesse said. He told the lawyer to serve any papers to Arthur Blaine on Main Street. "This conversation is over. You are not going to see those children today." Silas insisted he had a court order. Jesse corrected him. "You have a petition from Missouri. We are in Wyoming territory. Your paper from Missouri means nothing until a judge here says it does." "I already checked." That was the first time the lawyer's composure broke. He shot a look at Silas. "This is not finished," Silas said, his eyes locked on Ruth. It was a look she knew well, a look of possession that he tried to pass off as concern. "They are Henry's girls. They belong with family." Ruth stepped next to Jesse. "They are with their family. You were never family, Silas. You were their nightmare. And if you ever come near them again, I will tell every judge from here to Washington what you did. I will tell them every word you said while standing over my bed. And I will find the neighbors who heard the screaming and chose to do nothing." Silas's mask of control slipped, revealing the deep rage underneath. But this time they stood in the bright daylight. Jessie Hawkins was by her side and Tom was right behind her. Inside the house, her 2 girls were safe. "Get on your horse," Jessie said in a low voice. "Go to town and do this the legal way. You are not welcome on my property. If you return without a judge and a marshal, I will treat you just like any other trespasser." The lawyer took Silas by the arm, urging him to go. Silas shook him off and stared at Ruth with cold fury, like a man who could not believe the world would deny him anything. "Henry would be so ashamed of you," he said. Ruth's voice was steady. "Henry would have killed you for what you did to his children." Silas finally mounted his horse and rode away without a backward glance. Ruth watched until he was nothing more than dust. Then her legs gave out and Jessie caught her. "He is not going to stop," she whispered. "Then we will not stop either," Jessie promised, holding her tight. "He walked onto our land, Ruth, and he left without those girls. That is a victory. It is the first of many." She pressed her face into his chest. "It is enough." The weeks that followed were harder than any blizzard she had ever survived. Arthur Blaine, their lawyer, filed petitions and gathered statements. Hattie gave testimony so fierce the clerk had to ask her to speak softer. Tom described the state they were in when they arrived. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had been cold to Ruth, signed a letter about the family's good character. Jessie sold 10 head of cattle for the legal fees and would not hear any of her protests. A judge scheduled the hearing for June. For 3 days after the notice came, Ruth could not eat. Jessie found her late one night, just staring into the darkness of the kitchen. "What if it is not enough?" she asked. "What if his money is enough to buy the judge? What if they take my girls from me?" Jessie's answer was simple. "Then I will ride to Missouri, and I will bring them home." He told her, "I am not being dramatic. Those girls are not going back to a man who hurt them. If the law fails us, I will not fail them." "You would break the law for children who are not yours by blood?" "They are mine by every way that counts," Jessie said. "Blood did not protect them, Ruth. Blood is what hurt them. What I offer is better. It is choice. I chose them, and I choose them every single day." Ruth took his hand, no longer surprised by the fierceness in this quiet man. Grief had silenced him, but love was making him loud. The hearing was in Cheyenne, a 2-day ride away. They left the girls with Hattie, and Nora cried, begging to go with them. "I should be there to tell them what he did," she insisted. Ruth knelt down. "Sweetheart, you wrote it all down. The judge will read every word." Nora's lip trembled. "What if you lose? Then I will come home, and we will decide what to do next, together. I promise you I will come home." Emmy stood behind her sister, clutching 2 small wooden horses. She tugged on Ruth's sleeve and whispered into her ear. Ruth listened, then closed her eyes for a moment. "I will tell him, baby. I promise." She went to the wagon where Jesse was waiting. "Emmy wants you to know something," she said. "She says, do not let the mean man win. She says you are her papa, and papas do not let mean men win." Jesse gripped the side of the wagon so hard his knuckles turned white. He took 3 deep breaths, then turned and crouched down. He held out his hand to Emmy. Emmy walked down the steps and put her small hand in his. She looked at him with her father's brown eyes. "I will not let him win," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "That is my promise to you, Emmy Hawkins." She squeezed his fingers before running back to Hattie. Jesse stood up, and Ruth saw a look on his face she had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had finally found what he was willing to die for, and he was at peace with it. "Let us go," he said. The courthouse was sweltering and packed. Silas sat with his lawyer and 2 men Ruth had never seen. She and Jesse sat with their lawyer Blaine, who was calm and ready. The judge was a gray-bearded man who listened intently. He read every single document, including Nora's 4-page written statement, which made the clerk's hands tremble as he read it out loud. Silas's argument was about blood right and money. He claimed Ruth had taken the children illegally and married a stranger. Blaine's case was simpler. He called Ruth to the stand. She told the absolute truth about the nights of terror, the screaming, and the door that had no lock. She told her story in a calm, steady voice, the same one she used for Nora's arithmetic lessons. She didn't shed a tear, and she never once looked at Silas. When she was done, the lawyer called Jesse to the stand. Jesse Hawkins walked to the front of that courtroom holding his hat in his hands. He looked the judge square in the eye and told him about a woman who showed up in a blizzard with 2 half-frozen children and a lie on her lips. He talked about Emmy's blue lips and carrying her to the fire. He told them about Nora in the barn saying she was watching him. He talked about carved wooden horses and charcoal drawings, and a 4-year-old girl who whispered the word warm like it was a prayer. "Those girls came to my house as strangers," Jesse said. "But they will leave as my daughters. Not because of a piece of paper, but because I watched them heal. I watched them learn to trust again after the man who was supposed to protect them shattered that trust. I watched a 7-year-old carry her whole family on her little shoulders." He kept his eyes on the judge, the one man who held their future in his hands. "I ain't a perfect man, Your Honor. I still talk to my dead wife at night. I probably work too hard. I never even wanted children. But wanting and choosing are different. I chose these girls. I choose them every single morning and every single night. That ain't about blood. It's about a choice you make every single day." The courtroom fell silent. The judge held up a hand to stop Mr. Pruitt from speaking. He turned to Silas. "Mr. Calloway, I've read this file. I've read the child's statement. I've heard the testimony. I have one question for you, and I expect an honest answer." "Of course, Your Honor," Silas said, straightening up. "Did you enter your deceased brother's wife's bedroom after dark on multiple occasions with the intent to intimidate her?" Pruitt whispered something to Silas, but Silas waved him off. "That was my property. She was living there for free." "That wasn't my question," the judge said. Silas's jaw tightened. "I might have spoken harshly. It was an emotional time." "Did the child, Emmeline, stop speaking after these visits began?" "I don't know when the child stopped talking. I wasn't paying her any mind." The judge nodded slow. "No, I don't suppose you were." He went back to his chambers. An hour passed. When the judge returned, his face gave nothing away. "Petition for custody is denied. The children will remain in the legal custody of Ruth and Jesse Hawkins. Mr. Calloway, you are to have no contact with these children. Any violation will result in contempt charges." Ruth felt all the air leave her body. Under the table, Jesse's hand found hers and squeezed tight. Silas stood up, his face like thunder. "This isn't over." "It is in my courtroom, Mr. Calloway," the judge replied. "I suggest you go back to Missouri." Silas stormed out, his lawyer scrambling behind him. The moment the door shut, Ruth started crying. Jesse pulled her close right there in the courthouse and just held her. Words weren't big enough for what they were feeling. "Let's go home," Jessie finally said. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's go home." The ride back took 2 days. For the first time in a long time, Ruth felt a strange, weightless kind of safety. It was real, legal, and nobody could take it away. Her daughters were hers. The law said so. The man beside her had stood up in a court and claimed them as his own. As they came over the last ridge, they saw the ranch spread out below, with a curl of smoke coming from the chimney. And on the porch, 2 little figures stood watching the road. Ruth waved. Nora grabbed Emmy's hand, and they took off running through the yard. Nora reached the wagon first, scrambling up before Jessie had even stopped the horses. "Did we win, Mama? Did we win?" "We won, baby girl. We won." Nora threw her arms around Ruth and squeezed with all her might. Jessie climbed down from the wagon. Little Emmy just stood there in the yard, looking up at him. "Hey there, little one," Jessie said, his voice soft. Emmy reached up with both her arms, a silent plea to be held. Jessie lifted her up, settling her against his chest. She put her head right on his shoulder and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "Papa," she said. It wasn't a whisper. It was a word, clear as a bell for everyone to hear. Jessie squeezed his eyes shut. Ruth watched tears stream down the face of a man who hadn't cried since he buried his first family. He just held Emmy to his heart and let the tears fall. Nora pressed against his side, and Ruth wrapped her arms around all of them. They stood like that in the yard as the sun went down, a new family, whole and unbreakable. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Ruth found Jessie on the porch. She sat beside him and took his hand. "Emmy spoke," she said quietly. "She did," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I heard her." Jessie Hawkins told her he would hear about this for the rest of his days. Ruth just leaned right into his shoulder. "3 months ago, you told me you did not want children." He turned to face her, this woman he had come to love through a hard Wyoming winter. "3 months ago, most days, I did not want to be alive." His calloused hands held her face, and his eyes had finally stopped grieving. "Now I have more than any man deserves. I am going to spend forever trying to earn it." "You do not have to earn it, Jessie. You just have to keep choosing it." He leaned in and said, "Every single day." Then he kissed her. Down the hall, little Nora lay awake in the quiet. There were no screams, no one pounding on doors. She pulled her sister Emmy closer in the dark. "We are home, Emmy. We are really home." On the floor, a drawing showed 4 figures standing close together. Above them, a single word in a child's shaky writing filled the sky. Family. Ruth Calloway had first shown up in Wyoming with 2 freezing little girls and a lie. Ruth Hawkins stood on her own front porch with her husband who loved her and children who were finally safe. This was a home no one could ever take from them. She had built it from nothing but desperation and the stubborn will to protect her girls. This was no fairy tale. There were no magic slippers or fairy godmothers. This was about a woman who kept walking through a blizzard because stopping meant she would die. It was about a good man who opened his door when it would have been a whole lot easier to keep it shut. It was about 2 little girls who taught the grown-ups what being brave really meant. That long Wyoming winter had locked 4 strangers in a house long enough to make them a family. The fire burned low. The lock on the bedroom door was never used because no one needed it anymore. Ruth Hawkins closed her eyes and knew, deep in her soul, she was right where she was supposed to be. Not where she ended up, but where she chose to be. She had built something that would last from the broken pieces. And she had 2 simple words a little girl gave her. Warm. Papa. That was enough. That was absolutely everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.